Alrighty, welcome back everybody. November's over, filming this on December 3rd. Gonna do the November trading monthly recap for you guys. Holy shit. Best month of my career, best week of my career, best trade of my career. Total in at $838,207.05. 60,000 away from $1 million in 1 month. Just crazy. In some ways, I actually expected to be here at some point, only because of the trade plan I had accounted for this scenario that played out, which again, we will go in great detail into it later in the video when we get into, week 3 here. But having it happen, is a little bit different of a story, how perfectly it happened. I mean, I almost couldn't be happier how it went down. Not only for this trade alone, but even without this trade alone in this month, I was already up, close to 200 grand. So it already was a very good November to start as it was. But you add one trade that I just had, pretty much max conviction on and pretty much the best move I could almost ask for. In a very short time frame, quicker than I expected. You get an insane month. And so for those who are keeping track, forget about maybe will I get to million. We're approaching 2. I don't know if I, knock on wood, we'll see what happens for December. But 2021 is the peak year at just over 2 million. And so we will see if December is a 200K plus month to get us over 2. No expectations. Again, I could take December off and feel great about my year as we're at now. So it is what it is. We'll see how December goes. But before December happens, let's review November. Let's start off exactly where we left off October, which is we were talking about very briefly this loss of 15 grand to start the month, and that was because of DJT. Let's go over to the actual daily chart here. I was talking about at the end of the October video that, this turned into what was the strongest stock in the market to then the weakest, pretty much going almost round trip from the breakout level in the low 30s. I started to get a little bit too convicted on the dip buy idea, and so I ended up losing more than I should have, which was 15 grand. Probably should have kept it more in the 7 to 8K range, but doubled my loss, taking a couple tries too many into, I believe, I think it was this day into this day. I was 1 day early before the actual multi-day bounce came. If we look at it here, yeah, this was on the 31st, so right here, this big day to the downside where it touched 33, I started getting long in the consolidation here, which honestly was kind of silly. There really is no confirmation that this is the bottom here. This is just the bottom for the morning and is now kind of going sideways the rest of the day. I thought the movement after hours here was kind of signifying maybe a gap up the next day, so I bought some more. Obviously, that wasn't the case. The next day pre-market, it gapped down pretty ugly. If we look at the chart here, once pre-market started, practically not too far in, it cracked, then cracked again. I sold my long, tried again when it was going red-green, thinking that was the move. Still weak, failed red-green on the second attempt, and then I sold my long there. So both together was negative 15K. Happy I sold because it did go much, much lower. It actually just tapped 30, and then that was the bottom, and then we actually finally had a multi-day move into the election. So annoyed. Didn't really, I think I did actually make money on the bounce, but it was like I made like 5K, so really made minimal back of what I actually lost, which is too aggressive too early. But it happens. It's not a big deal. It's just to start the month off on a wrong foot, but that's okay. Nothing really happened that was that meaningful until we get to the 7th, which really isn't the 7th. The 7th of November isn't really the day that the trade happened. It was obviously the sell the news event on DJT, which happened on the 6th. I just held into the 7th. And that's the one thing, again, if you go back and watch my October recap, I talk about how I just kind of really screwed up the long and then really screwed up the short. And so my read on it the entire time was never really great in the moment. But the one thing I kept pounding the table on that I kept saying to myself I knew to be the most convicted on was that whether Trump wins or loses the election, there will likely be a huge sell the news event. I said, it doesn't matter, either or. There's going to be a sell the news event. And that I was correct on. And that I traded very, very well. I was not super aggressive because, again, I was kind of, again, like I said, I was been tarnished by previous runs of not having the best read. However, I took size that I think I deserve and should have taken on it, and it turned out to be pretty decent. So if we actually go into the intraday, let's go back. I actually tried longing it on when Trump won. So I didn't want to long it overnight. I thought that was a little bit too risky. I didn't really feel all that strongly about whether he was going to win or lose. So I didn't want to take this long overnight, especially after cracking, and that just because of fear of uncertainty, if I remember correctly. Especially in after hours here, this huge spike and then drop, just all over the place, right? But once it was pretty obvious by, I don't know, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night that he was and was going to win, I actually woke up early to see if I could try to fill out the open here, a pre-market open, and catch this spike. Unfortunately, my orders just did not go through nearly as quickly. I was only on a few hours of sleep. I woke up like 5 minutes ago right before the pre-market open. For whatever reason, didn't work. And so I just went back to bed. I thought, whatever, we'll check back in on it closer to the market open. In hindsight, probably would have gotten short here. That could have been the spike that all it had and dropped ever since, which is what happened. But I didn't check back on it and really until, here. But I was going to the day of like, hey, we clearly put a nice top now at 55, double top from, the previous day's high. If we still have it in the chart, we don't. But, when the top day that I screwed up on, that was at 55 high. There's a lot of levels now, and there's these level at 48. There's a smaller level at 48 or 49. There's a few levels up here. So going into the open, I thought to myself, worst case, it shouldn't get over 55, but we'll see how it does at these levels here. Unfortunately, it's one of those ones that worked too well too quickly to where I really actually never got full size until later in the afternoon. So if we look at it, let's get rid of the long here. Let's get rid of that one. We'll go over that next. Sell the news here. Right here. And so I get short like 1K shares early pre-market right before the open because I just want to get a starter on. Add a little bit more on that last pop. You can barely see it, but it's right here, this little pop that it had before it then pulled back. I got up to 2K shares, and then, and these 2K shares was wide risk on pretty much up here. I was willing to let it go that far. At this point, I really should have risked and moved it down to 48. But again, you wait less than 1 minute left, and it's already down to sub 40. And the crazy part is it never went over 40 ever again the rest of the day. I was expecting maybe some kind of bounce to have it go up, or just midday, some kind of volatility. It never did that. And so, if you look at the charts here, I did cover some into this pull towards red or green, added back on this bounce once it realized it probably doesn't have the juice to go into the VWAP, and then into the close, I knew I wanted to swing, so I added a little bit more. At this point now can risk these highs with some profits locked in. I forget how many shares I total had, but I definitely had more than 2K once the trend was kind of set, and then took that overnight into the next day, which then we got a sick gap down and fade. And covered the rest into this morning pull. Didn't have the patience to hold it for after hours, so I left a little bit of money on the table there. But you can see it here. That's the other trade we're about to go over next. DJT, right? Covered into this wash. Like the goal the whole time was sub 30. So once we got into the 29s, 28s, I thought to myself, okay, this is pretty much it. I thought there was a world we would see this, but I thought if we were going to see it, we would have seen it much more quickly, like in the morning. So once we weren't and we were kind of starting to bottom here, I just said, just lock it in. Like it's not worth holding on for $2 more a share in the event that it does bounce. Because my fear was that he was going to say something like put out a tweet, some kind of news or headline was going to come out, and it would spike back. So I didn't want to swing it for too long. And I think what was the next day that it did have something happen? I forget what was maybe announced here, but it obviously did bounce. So I'm happy I did cover, even if I don't get the bottom, I'm not here to play that game. I am glad I locked that in. I locked in about 33 grand on this one. And then also alongside DJT, I also did the same thing for PHUN. On and into the Sell the News event, I did the same thing. So into the 6th, I got short and then covered on the 7th. If we look at the actual trades here on this one, all right, these are the entries on this one. Again, same thing, a little bit more, I wouldn't say bigger dollar size, but just a lot more opportunity to get a little more entry. It bounced a little bit better than DJT did instead of that just 1 minute to get short. Covered it into these pulls, not all of it, but most. And then thankfully into the close was a nice little squeeze here that I was able to add some size back. And so held it overnight just like DJT. And the next day, we get to catch it gap down. The issue here was, not the issue, the thing that irritates me though about this one is that I kind of got bored. Like I already had covered DJT and then I was just now sitting in PHUN and I thought to myself, I would have thought PHUN would have been weaker by now. It had stayed pretty weak all of its backside. When you even look at the daily chart, it didn't bounce nearly as much as DJT did. So I thought this should probably have already sold off more. So I kind of covered here out of boredom to some degree, or just like lost hope that it was going to go lower. Obviously, that was the last minute it never saw the bounce, and then it actually went to my goal, which was more towards 6. So coulda, shoulda, woulda made an extra 30, 40 cents. No big deal. Definitely wouldn't have reshorted and touched it. I think this drop was because, well, one, DJT got weak, but two, I think also PHUN, I think posted earnings, if I'm not mistaken. I remember they had something overnight. So either way, I'm happy with it. Made like 14K on this one. So those two together, I mean, we're pushing, almost a 50K day, which it ended up being. I think I also made, that was on the 7th. I think I made 10K more on DXYZ, which we'll talk about in a bit after. But yeah, super, super sick sell the news event. Like I said, I screwed up most of the moves on the way up and on the way down. But once the election happened, that was the one I was most convicted on, at least happening. Was I most convicted on the sizing? Not necessarily. Like I said, I kind of wimped out on actually getting short most when it most needed to be, when it was the weakness in the morning. But I am happy with the overnight hold to get an extra, few dollars a share out of it. So there's that one. There was also SONN. This is one of the better gap and craps of the month. Again, not most will go straight back to where they came from in terms of red, green, and round trip. I just mentioned this one because I think I'm going to highlight the best and worst gap and crap of the month for me. Because other than these two, or those two I'm going to go over, there's not much. Gap and craps weren't a huge part of my month. They didn't really do much for me. But I just like this one because this one did do an offering midday, which obviously, made it that much more sweet. On the 6th, if we go into it, let's just do this. And where did I get short? I got short on some kind of lower low. Yeah, here. I think I missed the halt down. And so when it bounced, I wanted to get short. Yeah, this halt down, I thought, okay, it's probably dead. Reshorted into this bounce and then had a wide stop like I usually do. And then took a bit. I mean, this took about into an hour and a half in to make me think, I think a lot of people probably got shaken out here. It almost looked like it either some breakout buyers are buying this triple top or some shorts are covering, but it stuffed that. And then the fade then began, but really wasn't that far off its highs. I mean, it went from 9 to 7 and then the offering happened. And that's when the real fade happened, right? Then it went from 7 to 5 and then from 5 into the 3s by the close. So that's really what killed it. I was patient enough to wait till pretty much red green at the first cover here or close to it and then into the close for the rest into 350. So I got absolutely crushed, locked in 11K on this one. So that was good. But again, that was on the, when was that? That was on the 6th. We went over the 7th. Also on the 7th was DXYZ, a parabolic. That's what got me over 50K. If we just go into it real quick, I think it was on, the 8th, right? Or no, the 7th. Yeah, let's just look at the 7th real quick. Right here. Yeah, parabolic out the open. Wasn't the smoothest on the backside. I remember I had to be pretty patient to ride through this chop. Finally got the pull. I remember covering about half into like this 22 area, thinking holding the rest for possibly low a day or 20. Unfortunately, it did bounce back. And when it bounced back into this range of this, 24 support that it had held, once, twice, 3, but 4 times here, I said, okay, if it's going to come back in that range, this is just not going to fade like I want it to. So I did cover the rest there, locked in, I think, 11K or so. I'm happy I did with that because obviously the rest of the day you had to really wait for it to go lower. And even then it was only from this low of 2150 down to 2080. It's not worth, holding through this whole chop. And it's no longer a parabolic after this move here. So that was nice to see. But what really ended up happening, which is ultimately why this month was already really solid before MSTR, was that this was turning into an A+ setup for me. This had run from now pretty much 10 to nearly 50. Lance Breinstein has made a really good video on this one, so I would recommend checking that out. But essentially, this run here was getting hot because of SpaceX, also hot because of Tesla, retail, and then I think that just overall trading markets kind of started tying DXYZ and Tesla together for the time being, only because both had relations to SpaceX, even though Tesla has zero. The relationship between Tesla and SpaceX is Elon, but there's no actual fundamental reasoning behind it unless, Tesla owns shares of SpaceX, which I don't know. I don't think they would, but maybe they do. But DXYZ does own shares of SpaceX privately, right? And I think they just had a launch or two. Elon was very tied to the side of Trump during the election, so everything was going nuts, and DXYZ caught wind of that. Now, the difference here, though, is that DXYZ is still a $5 stock. technically. Its net asset value is like 530. It's the same it was back here. This is why this was such a good short. I think I made over 100 grand on this entire move from the hundreds down to, I think it wrote it down back to the 20s on a different multiple kind of swing trades. But same idea, same thesis. Nothing has changed. The NAV is still at $5. It's never technically going to go there, at least for the short term here, because people are willing to pay a premium to own some of these private companies publicly. So it makes sense that it never went to 5, but consolidating 10 for months, formed a really good base. But still, going from 10 to now 40 or 50, to me, I viewed this run as just a second chance if you screwed up on this run. And so that's exactly how I treated it. I took max size, A++, kind of stars aligning. Got short on this day because I had a feeling that either 50 was going to be a nice round number, but not initially. But I had a feeling that if they couldn't have the juice to go higher, it was probably going to put in some kind of doji red candle like it did. And then the next day was really the first red day, but the gap down was so big. If you didn't swing overnight, it was kind of tough. It is riskier, obviously, to swing overnight, but it's something I've learned I kind of have to do on some of these if I want to, catch that move. Because if I don't, the gap down's so big, I never want to chase the gap down. And so it is a risk I am willing to take sometimes. Not all the time, but on DXYZ, where I was very convicted of a pullback to happen, I was willing to hold it overnight. So what ended up happening was it was A+ setup. I deemed it to be A+ setup. I made a pre and post video, a video lesson for Clover subscribers talking about like why it's so ideal. Pretty much what I just went over in short form. A+ for me is like I want to risk 45K, 45 to 50K. I think it deems and demands that kind of risk. The tough part here was that I got a little too early on the initial part. Okay, you can see I can't really zoom in on this trade, but let's zoom in on this chart. So when we cracked, I thought, okay, this bounce I want to attack. It wasn't full size right away, which was my savior. It would have sucked had I taken a full 40K plus loss and only 10 minutes of action, but I knew that was not enough confirmation of backside to get short. So I only had about half size. I had about 20K risk max. And so when I did cut that trade right here, up over the highs, I lost 20 grand. No big deal. I still have 25K or so left of risk. It tapped 50 like I thought. So when it stuffed, I then ended up immediately shorting back. You see those arrows of me chasing a little bit, even down all the way down to as low as like 44 into this bounce especially. I pretty much short almost all my size back again, plus a little bit more, so I'm now risking like 25, 30K. Okay, so worst case, if I go over 50, I'm probably losing 50K with some slippage. I was okay with that. It would have been better had I not ever taken this initial loss, but it happens. I would have had more size, probably at the same average because I hadn't taken that initial 20 and would have been risking all 45 at this point, especially into this bounce. That was the level I wanted to risk now. Into this pullback, and this is my biggest mistake, I think, of the trade. Into this move here, I only covered what I shorted here, which was about 25% of my size. And now I expected this to hold red-green. I did not expect this. Red-green was what? It was around like 35, 36-ish. I thought I could test red-green. I thought I could maybe go red. But I thought ultimately, whether it gets there or not, a bounce will be coming. Okay. Now, did I think a bounce back to 48 was coming? No. I thought a bounce back to, 46 maybe max was coming. 45, 44, 46, somewhere in there. And so I think my mistake was that I didn't cover enough here. I only covered a fourth. I should have covered at the minimum half. Because had I covered that much, I would have locked that much more in. I would have erased my entire loss initially. And then I actually would have had size to then add back into this bounce. Now, like I said, I didn't expect it to go to 48, so there's no way I would have shorted that. But I would have 100% shorted some at 44, some at 45, and probably got some at 46. But as you see here, I didn't do that. Why? Because when it started bouncing to those levels, I thought, crap, I didn't cover it all quickly enough in the 38s. I don't have the capabilities at the moment to reshort. You could argue, okay, well, just be as aggressive and put back what you covered here. But I was doing the math and I got a little bit emotional in the moment of trying to push. Again, I'm trying to push this envelope of risking 45K, which is not my norm. It's what I do on A+ setups. But I'm teetering between that. Like, you're almost making emotional decisions, but you're also pushing the envelope of making sure you're risking how much you say you're going to risk. And so for whatever reason, or all that being considered, it's like I just decided, let's just play it safe. Let's just stick to the 50 risk, not get emotional, and let this bounce fade. Then it died, and once this happened, I said, okay, game on. 50 is a good level I want to stick to. Let's look to then add back on any bounces after this pull and look to swing. And so that's what happened. Once we bounced back, I added some here. Did get a little bit scared. I think what I shorted here, I covered that here as it was spiking over this kind of double top of like 43, 44. But once that failed, I realized it was just probably me covering because it was such little. There was practically no volume in after hours, right? Immediately shorted back that size, chasing it a bit, but again, it was illiquid. And then we are indicating a gap down by the close. I said, okay, great. This is probably going to gap down. And boy, did it gap down, right? It gapped down massively. It went, the lows here was 37s. It opened at 37 or sub yesterday's low. So there was really no opportunity to get short anywhere near yesterday's range unless you, got short early pre-market. And so I'm happy with the swing. Next day, I then covered some into the low 30s, like 30.50 to be specific. However, I did not cover it all. I was very convicted and saying, very similar to the previous run, right? Over here, when this got crushed, it got crushed. It was down from 100 to sub 30 within 4 days. And so for me, I said, you know what? I think 30 is the minimum. I think if anything, 25 is on deck, 50% off the highs. And so I held the rest of my shares. I think I had either half left, saying, that's great. I covered some at like 30.50, but like I'm no ifs, ands, or buts. I will hold the rest till sub 30. Locked in plenty now. Let's give it a day or two. And so the next day, when it didn't go sub 30, I said, okay, great. Let's possibly add some shares. I don't know if I screenshotted it. Did I? No, I didn't, unfortunately. But I did add some shares back. So whatever I covered here, I definitely ended up getting short some, I think at like 35 and then some 34. And then I think into the close, I added a little bit more at 33. At this point, moving my risk down probably to 37 because now this is a good level from the top day's support and then the first red day's resistance. And honestly, even in pre-market of the bounce day here, it topped out right below 37 too. So that was a good level. Next day, gap down, flushed under 30, and then I covered the rest at 27, 28s. Now, you might say, Kyle, like, well, why didn't you, here it is, right? No, that's the top. That's the one day. Where's the other? Or did I mix them up? No, it's right here. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Right, cover the rest into this 28, 27 level, and then the last final piece into the close at like 28 and a half. The reason why I did this, I was very conflicted. I said, there's a world this goes one more day lower, sub 25, like I think. But again, this stock was also following Tesla somewhat. And if we look at Tesla real quick, I think Tesla was getting oversold. Not super oversold, but oversold enough to make me think like, hey, this could have a green day. And although I don't think DXYZ should be following Tesla whatsoever, but if Tesla bounces, like DXYZ is going to, whether I like it or not, and I just don't care to, I already was patient enough to hold through, this bounce, right? This choppy day. I'm like, do I really want to hold over another bounce just so I can get an extra $2 a share from 27 to 25? Even though the original goal was sub 30, I was like, no, let's take it off. And so that's why I did cover the rest there. Ultimately locked in $121,000. So call it if my full risk was like 45 grand, call it a 3-to-1 risk reward. And that's with really it was more like 4-to-1 because I was only risking 30 grand on the actual attempt that worked, but I didn't want to go over the total 45 to 50 with slippage on the overall loss. So either way, great 6-figure trade. Had been a while since I had actually locked in 6 figures like that on a red day, first red day setup. So I'm very happy with that. And then of course, I'm even more happy with my decision because the next day it did bounce. And even since then, and we'll talk about this later in the video, it is still bounced and is up near where it bounced to, which is quite surprising. I was, we'll talk about it later, but I, thought this would be more likely of more fade, but this has done nothing but be insanely resilient and holding up, which was not on my bingo card. So we'll talk about that later. But anyways, next up is APLM. This was the worst gap and crap of the month for me. You can kind of probably tell why. It had a huge wick, and once it wicked, I did not reshort. They did a reverse split, though, because this was not at $36. It probably was 36 cents, if I'm not mistaken. Let's get rid of DXYZ. Yeah, 36 cents. So they almost did. So they did 100 for one reverse split. But yeah, got short on what I thought was a lower low, and we'll actually go into the chart just to pull it up here. Let's go to 15 days. right? Thought what would be this first lower low, especially after that stuff move to roll over, got short. It so far was looking good to start it. Did a lot of sideways action, which typically, I mean, not typically, but in a lot of cases will eventually roll over at some point. But instead of rolling over, it did the opposite. Volume started coming in, and then, a squeeze pretty much from 18 to 36, a 100% move happened. I wouldn't say out of nowhere, because I'm sure there was something that drove this, but I was not aware of it. And so I got, once I gave it a little room over high day, once I realized it was just way too strong for its own good, I covered the rest for a 9K loser. Happy to cut it here though, because it went a whole nother 50% higher from, the mid 20s to 36. But unfortunately, it then did give it all back. So if I was a little more aggressive and willing to give it a second attempt, it would have worked out A-okay, or maybe would have made back my losses at the minimum. But again, 9K is not the end of the world. It's becoming much more of an average loser for me as time goes on. So it is what it is. It's just one of those weird ones where, I thought I was right waiting for this action to stuff and then wait for the fade, but it really needed a much, much bigger move before it really, really died. So that's that. Now, the lovely moment everyone, I'm sure, has been eager to listen in. So again, that was the 14th of DXYZ. We go into next week, the 18th, 18th I think was APLM, one of these days. Then we get into the 20th and 21st. So these 2 days were all MSTR. Let's go. Let me get rid of some. Let's just get rid of these here. On these tabs. MSTR. Incredible parabolic. Massive opportunity for longs and shorts. And oddly, this was a huge opportunity for me long and not so much short. If you know my style, you would think this 600 plus gain between these 2 days in MSTR would be the short side. It wasn't. I only made about, I think, 70K or 60 something K on the short side, and so the other 600 was on the long side. So let's just dive into how on earth did I find this thing, and what did I do with it? Like, how did I even come across and prepare here? Because I had an average of 135ish, all up in here. And my goal was to sell like 4, 5, 6, maybe 700, depending how crazy it got. Did I think it was going to happen in 3 months? I think the last piece I bought was somewhere up in here, like mid-September. September is like 16th, 17th, 18th here was my last few buys. Did I think it was going to happen in 3 months later into November? No. I thought it was at least a 6-month thing, if not longer. But when it happens sooner than I expected, I just can't not take it. But before I get into that, I got a lot of questions. Like, how did you even know? Right? How are you even, when I'm starting telling people like, oh no, I'm in from this price. They're like, wait, what? For those who don't know, and some of you do, but most of you probably don't, I do a lot of, obviously stock trading recaps, small cap, penny stock trading recaps. But what a lot of people don't know, at least I have signs of it, right? Of Bitcoin, is that I am in the trenches when it comes to Bitcoin and crypto, and not necessarily trading. I don't day trade crypto at all, but in terms of finding maybe some coins that I like long term, and more specifically, really just Bitcoin. Like, I think I have my portfolio was like 90% Bitcoin, and then it's like 5% Ethereum, and then 5% altcoins and meme coins. Like the disparity is not even close, right? But the amount of hours I have watched and read and just studied crypto and Bitcoin specifically, one of the accounts that's that's part of the $600,000 in gains, I owned it from 65 way back here. I actually was a bag holder for a bit, and I never bought more of MSTR down here because I was buying more Bitcoin. When Bitcoin was at 16, 17, 18K and MSTR was down here in the 20s, I was just buying Bitcoin. But I had bought an MSTR somewhere around here in the mid 60s with $10,000 worth, just a long-term account that I thought, if I believe in Bitcoin, I think MSTR is just another way to expose myself to it. And so I had been holding for years on that account. I didn't buy anything or any more of it until, in the 130s. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But the point was, some people ask me, like, how did you even know MSTR was a thing? It's like, I've been knowing it, right? I've been reading up on Saylor. I have an addiction, arguably. I look at Bitcoin's price and watch its price action almost multiple times a day, right? It's just something I do now that I study. And like when I'm eating or cooking dinner, like I watch and listen to podcasts on Bitcoin and crypto. Like it is hundreds of hours So with that disclaimer in mind, like understand this is not just something like, oh, I read momentum good, I'm a good day trader, and I just stumbled upon this thing. Like, no. This is years of understanding in the making. And so, but what stopped me though from ever buying any MSTR and waiting until, not even waiting, but pretty much getting myself, a slap in the face and saying, Kyle, you need to buy more here at the 130s. It wasn't until what Michael Saylor, the CEO of MSTR, and what a lot of people who were analyzing MSTR would call it a Bitcoin yield. Now, it's not really a Bitcoin yield because a yield sounds like a dividend, like you're getting paid out, and no one's ever actually getting paid out on MSTR. But the cool part is about what Michael Saylor is doing with MSTR is that he is diluting current shareholders of MSTR, taking that money, going to buy more Bitcoin. But in the way he's doing so, it actually ends up getting the shareholders more Bitcoin per share than they originally got diluted on. So this is going to be very, very rough math for the simplicity of this video. But let's say he dilutes MSTR shareholders by 10%. Okay. He will then be able to go out and use that cash to buy more Bitcoin, and he will give shareholders back more than 10% of what they diluted in. So this is not actual number math again, but let's say every MSTR shareholder had 1 Bitcoin per share. Again, it's not actual, it's a much, much smaller of a fraction, but just for simplicity's sake, if you owned 1 share of MSTR, you owned 1 equivalent of a Bitcoin. Because he was continually diluting his shares and then buying more Bitcoin, your Bitcoin per share ratio went up, okay? And so it was around this time that I said to myself, wait a minute. And I remember seeing a tweet or an article somewhere that year to date, so pretty much from MSTR going from the 60s to the 130s, there was a 17% increase in what you'd call the Bitcoin yield or the Bitcoin per share ratio. So shareholders of MSTR who had 1 share of MSTR here at the beginning of the year still had 1 share in the middle of the year and in July, August area, owned 17% more Bitcoin. And they didn't have to do anything. Okay? It's a full opposite of an ETF. You could buy an ETF, you could buy IBIT, right? That follows Bitcoin. You could buy IBIT, but IBIT has a fee. IBIT charges, I think, 0.25% per year. So it's very simple. Let's say IBIT, 1 share of IBIT is 1 Bitcoin. Well, guess what? After holding it for 1 year, you don't own 1 Bitcoin anymore. You own 99.75% of a Bitcoin because they're taking that fee away. MSTR, while they're at least diluting and buying more Bitcoin on their balance sheet, it is the opposite. You are getting more Bitcoin per share. All right. Now, granted, do I think this can last forever? No. And there's a lot of skeptics that have come out really bashing MSTR for this. And I partially agree. However, I think a lot of people don't understand what's actually happening to where it's actually much more sustainable than I think people think. Now, granted, I am someone who doesn't want it to go forever because I think if it goes forever, it ends up having Saylor owning too much of the supply of Bitcoin, which defeats the purpose of Bitcoin of itself. But it doesn't matter what happens in the long run. All I know is what's happening right now and what's going to happen next 3, 6, 12 months, which is Michael Saylor is going to dilute as much as he possibly can of MSTR, take that money, buy more Bitcoin, and then have that yield, right, that yield go up. And even now at current prices, I think the Bitcoin yield is now 40%. So now you own 1.4 of a Bitcoin, 40% more than when you started, right? So that yield is still increasing. Now, granted, there's a lot more, and actually I'll show you guys real quick. There's a website, it's called mstr.tracker or -tracker.com. Shows you all the metrics, right? The actual Bitcoin per share is 0.0017. So it's a much lower percentage. But again, that was 40% lower to start the year. Okay, and it's only increased. It shows the market cap, it shows it's trading at its net asset value, or its NAV, its premiums to NAV. It shows you all the things, right? Even a bunch of charts, etc. Okay, and so I had known this. And so once I kind of put the pictures together of like, oh, wait, this yield is only going to continue to increase because I know Saylor's not going to stop buying more Bitcoin. Like, this is going to go nuts. Not only is it going to go nuts, but even if it didn't have a yield, right, and it just held Bitcoin of wherever it has a history of going nuts. This was the last Bitcoin run in 2021 when Bitcoin ran from 20K up to nearly 70K. MSTR had an epic run from 20 to 130. Okay. Because it had Bitcoin on its balance sheet and it wasn't doing nearly as much buying of Bitcoin as it is now, right? Not only that, if you know MSTR back from the .com bubble, I don't think my chart can even show it because it's been over 20 years. It doesn't show it. But back in 2000, 2001, MSTR had a massive parabolic run because it was part of the internet, right? It was part of the .com boom. So this this ticker has a massive history of being able to go parabolic and do it in a massive way. So you already time in the characteristics that it already owns Bitcoin, and then it's buying more Bitcoin to create this upward spiral. To me, it was a no-brainer. I immediately started kind of scaling in a little bit in the 130s, but I really didn't add full size until I realized that, hey, this is probably going to have a bigger return than Bitcoin itself. I said, I need to be buying more on this. And that's when I added a bunch of more size in the 130s last chance I could have. Did I know it was the last chance I could have? No. I frankly thought I was going to have much more time, but I'm glad I bought as much as I did. In total, I had like 1,700 shares and change over a cross of like 5 or 6 accounts. And I say that because I just took all of extra cash that I had, and I had a long-term account on my personal name. I had a long-term account on my LLC. I had an account that was earning just high interest on high yield savings account. I said, you know what? Why am I sitting in cash here to make 5% when I am almost 90% certain that this is going to work? I bought it with that. I had money in my Roth. I said, yep, we're going to throw this in the Roth. So I just pretty much threw a reasonable, not overly amount, but about 200 grand worth or so, whatever 1,700 shares is times 130, across 5-6 accounts. And yeah, I just said I'm going to hold, and I said until this thing goes parabolic and until Bitcoin does the same, like I have no reason to really sell. The first piece I started selling at 350. I then sold more at like 400. Then sold more at like the 430s. I then sold my first entire account was out in the 480s. Once it put the top in just over 500 on the 20th of November, that's when I started getting a little bit scared of like, hey, I still had at the time like 1,000 shares left of the 1,700. And I thought to myself, hey, this is getting overblown. This could pull back big. You should probably be selling more. So I remember selling some into after hours on that day, right here, into, like this one of these bounces. That's why you see some of it's locked in on this day, because that was the 120 or so of this 130 was me selling my first entire account completely flat, because I thought to myself, there's a world this gaps down and flushes, and like it just tapped 500, which is like in the range. My range was like 400 to 700, depending on how crazy it got. I just said, I need to be selling some. And so once I got the gift of a gap up, because this is when now Bitcoin's like rushing towards 100K. It was at like 97, 98K at the time. We got a huge gap up to 540, 550. And then I realized, hey, I think this gap up is an insane gift. Yes, do I think and want it to go to 700 or 600? Totally. But like once this pulls back, this is when the momentum, or this is when the long-term thesis of mine shifted to, okay, I am a momentum day trader. I know what this looks like. If I wasn't long here, I'd be licking my chops for a short. I probably need to get out, because in the name of thinking that this can go to 600 for 50 more bucks a share, this can pull back easily 100 to 150 bucks a share. The risk reward up here doesn't make sense for me to hold on to my shares. It just doesn't. So that is when I then sold the rest of my shares. I started selling all up in here, especially when it started cracking. I pretty much sold it all by 520. And at that point, I then said to myself, okay, I'm finally no longer bullish. Like I've sold all my longs, for a 2-3x from 130. It's like, now do I get short? And this is where I struggled mentally, because again, momentum speaking, day trading Kyle speaking, I knew, okay, great. Yes. Like I should be getting short. But bullish Kyle, bullish me, who just made this massive long trade, another underlying factor why I was so convicted on long is because if you've been around Bitcoin and crypto bull runs long enough, you know how incredibly resilient they are. And I mean, they will go further than anyone expects. Okay. And I say that not only from seeing it, but also being in it, which back in 2017, back in 2021, there were times where I wanted to short it because I thought it was too overdone, or some of these Bitcoin moves were just too much too soon. And I got steamrolled over and over and over again. And so naturally, when this happened, I had a little bit of, PTSD pop up. I had flashbacks of like, is this really a short I want to take? And I said, I kind of shut that off. And I said, Kyle, you just made 600 grand, like get short. Right? Just start in, get a feeler, and add it to it whenever it starts working. And so that's what I did. So this is the long. Obviously, I took a daily chart picture just to show that I was, the bigger picture of what actually happened, not just an intraday of me selling. Also because I scaled all the way up into the picture. This isn't the only sell, right? I think my total sell over all of them was like really high 400s. But once we got to the short, I just hit start in. So really these candles were only like a couple hundred shares or so. Because I thought to myself, okay, if I'm going to risk anything, it's going to be 550. But, I really didn't know how much conviction I should have on this. And this is the one mistake where me being so bullish and me having that kind of PTSD, so to speak, of how strong these can be, I really didn't risk as much as I should have, right? Because we just talked about DXYZ being an A+ setup and me risking, 45 grand. MSTR, from a technical perspective of how overextended this was and just how big of a runner this was, there's no doubt in my mind. And for everyone else who was getting short this day, like, this is A+. It just is, right? However, and unfortunately, due to my bias, did I put A+ size risk on? No, I did not. Instead of risking 45 to 50K, I only had about 20 to 30K on at risk, especially after this ad, right? So it's a bit frustrating because I think my bullish bias in the first place caused me to not be as aggressive on the short. But then again, I don't really beat myself up that much of it because the whole bullish bias in the first place is what got me to get long at 130 and sell for my biggest trade of my career. So, there's no world where I would have been short with 50K risk and would have made 600 grand, right? So my bullish case, although hurt me on the short side, it made me more money in the long run, right? And so anyway, covered a little bit into the pull. But again, when you look at this kind of daily chart, I thought to myself, if this is really going to pull, like, there's no way this holds red green. Like, this is going to get crushed at least at 450, if not lower. And so that's why I did hold the rest of my size for this pull into, sub 450. Then after that, I got a little bit uncertain about how much more it could pull. I was a bit, when it was spiking to V up was also when Bitcoin was actually quite strong and looking like it was going to test 100K. And I thought to myself, man, again, PTSD popping up again. I was like, man, if Bitcoin does another sick move overnight and like all of a sudden is trading at like 105, 106, 110, $1,000 per coin, like I do not want to be short MSTR. Now, granted, that was more forward thinking over a day or two in advance, when really if I just read the price action, clearly you can start seeing this trend over the next hour. Could have easily gotten short anywhere in here over 450, risking, the high 400s, and would have gotten another great risk reward move down to, sub 400. So shoulda, coulda, woulda, maybe reshorted, didn't. But again, I locked in around, 54K on this one. And then, like I said, one of the longs was my Roth IRA, right? And if you have a Roth IRA, you can't short sell it. You could buy puts as a form of short selling, but I can't actually just short the stock directly. Now, granted, I had scaled out enough of my size that by the time I sold it here, I had like 50K worth of buying power that was obviously already confirmed or I guess settled from previous sells. And so I bought MSTZ, which is obviously just a 2x inverse of MSTR. And so if actually we look into the actual trade, here, I bought it when I was getting short, and then I sold pretty much the same levels as when I covered it, just flipped it on its head. So I made another 12K there. And so that was that. Every single MSTR trade, the long and the short put together, around 680K. Best trade of my career, best week of my career, and then ultimately now giving me the best month of my career. So, long-winded story short, that's that. The one thing I will say is that, a lot of people have been coming out and bashing MSTR, and I understand why. However, I think majority of people who are bashing it have done very little research and actually know what they're talking about and looking into. Because yes, there is risks that MSTR is taking by going into debt and diluting their shareholders to buy more Bitcoin. But there's a world where they're becoming so in the black in terms of how much they're up on their Bitcoin, on top of the fact that their convertible loans or convertible debt will want to convert, which further gets rid of their debt, that I think people are going to be mistaken how well this might go. Now, I'm not saying it will go perfectly well. It could absolutely blow in their face. That's why the risks they're taking as a company. But at the same time, I think I've seen a lot of comments since it was going up of how people are bashing it and it's a pyramid scheme and all these things. I'm like, I don't think you've studied enough. I really don't. Yes, there's risks, but there's a lot of reward on the other end here. The one thing I'll say too, and again, don't take this to the bank. I haven't rebought any MSTR at all. But when we look at Bitcoin, and I think to myself like, hey, I don't think this runs over. I think 125, 150, maybe even 175 Bitcoin is easily on the table in the next 6 to 12 months. Again, I don't know where. I think it's anywhere in that range, but let's just say on the euphoric side, it gets to 150, right? I have a hard time thinking if Bitcoin goes to 150 and MSTR keeps buying more Bitcoin on their balance sheet, keeps increasing that yield, right? Keeps increasing that upward positive feedback loop, that 550 is going to be the top. It could be. 100% it could be. I'm not saying this as in like, oh, Kyle said to buy. No, that's not what I'm saying. I haven't even rebought, and I probably won't. But it hasn't escaped my mind yet that if Bitcoin keeps consolidating and then, let's say January it breaks over 100K and by March or April it's at 150, I have a hard time thinking MSTR's top is going to be 550. I just do. I genuinely do. We'll see. Timestamp this video, come back to it. Let's find out in next 6 months if that or next 6 12 months if that happens. But I think it just wouldn't surprise me if this is not the last of MSTR we've seen. It could be. This was a pretty big blow-off move. It would take a lot for this to break out. But again, they keep buying Bitcoin relentlessly. They now own over 400,000 BTC. Again, Michael Saylor has plenty of dilution and debt to that on cash on hand to keep buying more Bitcoin. Things just might get crazier. You never know. And the one thing I'll say too that makes it really the ironic part about Bitcoin and MSTR is that it makes the haters think they're right? Because every time, and this happens every single time, guys, and I've seen this numerous times. Bitcoin will go up, everyone calls it a scam, it drops. Oh, look, and the haters will go, oh, see, I told you I was right. And let's just go through Bitcoin's history and actually pull this chart to show this point. Okay, all the way back to 2011. Bitcoin goes up, oh, it's a scam. It drops, oh, I was right. Okay, you let time pass a little bit more. Oh, Bitcoin's a scam. Bitcoin's a scam. And, oh, look at, see, it dropped 80% off its highs. I'm right. Then you give it a little more time, and all of a sudden, oh, Bitcoin's a scam. Oh, but it's dropped 80% off its highs. Okay, look, I'm right. And then, it comes back. Oh, Bitcoin's a scam. But then it drops, 60, 70% off its highs. Oh, look, I'm right. And it's like, where do you think we are now? We're at the same step in history where everyone's like, Bitcoin's a fraud, Bitcoin's a scam. And yes, will it probably drop at some point another 50, 60, 70%? Probably. But if it's going to do another 50, 60, or 70% drop, where do you think the bottom is? Considering that when I just went through this chart, the bottom is increasingly higher every single time, right? Like if this pulls 70% back, what's 70% off of 150? Probably somewhere back in this range of like 60, 50K, right? So yes, could it absolutely trade back down to these levels? Of course. But again, I've seen how resilient these mother effers are, or this coin specifically, that I just think people who are hating on it are going to be in a world of disbelief for at least a little bit longer. And that's the beautiful part about it, because people are like, oh, I hate it. And all of a sudden you just look at it 10 years later and you're up 1,000,000+% because you can't, stomach the moves or just aren't willing to, do some research at why this happens. Like, this isn't random, guys. This, like the pulls, the big euphoric move, like this is not some bubble that happens every 4 years. Like it literally is programmed in many ways, shapes, and forms. So anyways, in terms of a more in-depth read on the actual MSTR yield and like the convertible bonds, this is a good thread that just shares the positives and the negatives. I highly recommend. I can maybe put this link in the description if you want to just read it, because obviously we won't go over it here. But just good stuff. I highly recommend you actually read up on it than just, listening to one person's opinion and then be like, oh, it's a scam. Do a little bit of digging. Read the Bitcoin white paper, right? Watch some videos, do some due diligence, etc. So anyways, long story short, that's that. Again, haven't rebought, don't have any plans on rebuying, but we will continue to monitor the entire sector as a whole. In terms of the last week, MSTR, I also then gave some money back on this day. It actually bounced, and unfortunately I went into this day thinking it was going to bounce because this was such an oversold day. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, into that morning, I then got bearish the last minute and then started chopping myself up short, which was really frustrating. Lost 14K pretty much over like 3 attempts. I think I have it here. Yeah. So instead of buying and getting long like I expected to for just a bounce, just a day trade bounce, I'm now shorting on red green, thinking it's going to go lower to like sub 350. Just really silly and dumb, considering I just flipped my thesis last minute for really no strong reason. So that was a bit annoying. And I call it no man's land chop because, right, there's just no reason for me to be in and out 3 times. There was just, if anything, it was holding, right? It's holding red, green, it's holding a higher low, and then this grind just happens all day long, right? So that was frustrating. Then next, like I talked about earlier, DXYZ wanted to put a short back on this bounce for a swing trade similar to what here, like if this was a 2-day bounce, I wanted to get short for more fade. Unfortunately, you see what happens. It did nothing but that. It had this huge, strong green candle into what was a SpaceX launch. I don't remember exactly what happened at the SpaceX launch, but it was more of a sell the news event. That's why it pulled back. But ultimately, it just kept holding up. And I honestly forget which day I covered, but I ended up losing 45K or 48K with some slippage and stuff, mainly because, again, I have now locked in 120K. It was A+ risk. I deemed this kind of swing idea and this thesis to be A+. So I put the same level of risk on. Unfortunately, we took a loser, and now, it's still chilling right now. It's not its highs, but holding way better than I expected. I think they have a pending effect coming to do more dilution, but that effect has been trying to happen since here. So I have no idea why the effect is delaying it, but I think once that goes through, the company's going to take massive advantage of this trading at 8x its net asset value. So we'll see what happens, but holding very, very interesting and oddly well. Ideally, this breaks 50 and goes to 80 or goes to 100 to give us another one, give us a third move, right? That would be a beautiful gift again. So there's that. However, and so that was on the 25th. So I cut on the 25th. Where was the 25th? Was that one of these days? Yeah, this was the gap up, right? When it looked like it was going to break out. Obviously, it died, so that was a bit frustrating. But I'm only down 11K, though, because on the same day, FFIE also was a swing short that I had covered. We've talked about the other portion of my swing that I covered, I think, last month or a month before. However, I had kept another half of my position on. And what I essentially was doing was just risking the weekly high. This doesn't show me weekly candles. It doesn't. So unfortunately, every week this was going lower, and it wasn't breaking the weekly high until right here. On the 25th, this was on a Monday, it broke over the previous 5 days high. So I thought to myself, you know what? Again, I'm swinging this from like 7. It's at the mid ones. I'm like, I've made the majority of my move. I only had like 6K shares left. So it's like, what am I really holding for it to go back down to 50 cents to make an extra $6,000? That's the thing about shorting, for it to go lower and lower and lower. You kind of have to add more size to kind of make up for that difference in position size. And if you don't, you'll still make more money. It just won't be as much. So with 6K at $1.50 was much different than 6K at, or more size that I had at 7 or 8. So once it broke the weekly high, I just said, okay, let's just cut it. Let's hope for it to bounce and then reshort if it goes to like 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of thing. Unfortunately, that was a fake out. It's faded lower cents and it's about to look like it's going to break 1. So shoulda, coulda, woulda still been short. But again, I had a trade plan. I stuck to it. It broke my risk. I covered. So locked in another like 40K or so there. So finished that day around negative 12 grand. And then on the 26th. Very similar to the DXYZ short overnight, I had QUBT short overnight. The quantum computing sector has been quite hot. If we get a daily chart here. Has been quite hot, and on this top day, very similar. DXYZ was obviously a red candle, but this one was a green one. But again, a wick to the bottom, look to the upside, kind of like a doji top day. Can't figure out which way it wants to go. If you look at the intraday, it's quite choppy. It's kind of a sign that like shorts have been squeezed out, and longs who are chasing think it's going higher because it is green on the day, but it doesn't have the juice to really get going. And it kind of had this blow off, mini move here. And so didn't touch it at all here, but did finally start getting short into the close as it was uptrending. Unfortunately, I didn't take a picture of these entries, but I did take a picture, obviously, of the exit, because the next thing it gaps down sub, yesterday's lows of 650, covered it all at like 630, locked in like 9 grand, nothing huge. But okay, I'm sorry. Here's the DXYC swing. Started in way too early at 36s, and then covered it all on that gap up, the high 30 or high 40s. So that was annoying. Oh, sorry. And then also FFIE cover. You could barely see it, but just covered it because I wish I actually took a weekly chart. This is a daily, but the weekly would have shown that it broke out over the previous week's high. So cover that there. But this is the QUBT. Again, I wish I actually had my picture of my arrows here, but do have my covers here in the low sixes, locked in $9,000, and that, is pretty much the last solid trade of the month. So long video short, guys. That is how I've come across my new best month of my career. Again, I'll leave this off with, we'll see how December goes. Again, I don't think the whole crypto trade is over. Not necessarily talking about MSR specifically, but again, I have plenty of spot Bitcoin directly. Again, I just don't think this runs over. We're going to find out in the next 6 to 12 months, but I think 100K is just the start. Not the start, I should say. We're about like, if we're doing a baseball analogy, we're about like 7 innings in. Let's put it that way. We're close to the end, but we're not there yet. And so I think people are going to be surprised at how crazy things might get. So we'll see. If I have a new better month in 2025, it won't become too much of a shock to me. But again, I've never been one to track my crypto gains on this because I hold crypto more long term. This has all been stock gains. So maybe I'll have to do some modifications if I decide to actually track the crypto P&L. But we'll see. That's for another day. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe. Comment below. I guess, I don't know, anything. How's it going? How's your day going? How's your year going? But anyways, thanks so much, guys. And I'll catch you guys for the December review and then also, obviously, the yearly review. If you haven't watched enough of my videos, when December ends, we do the December review, but then we get all the stats for the previous year, which I'll do for 2024, and we'll get that rolling and see how the year went as a whole. So anyways, see you guys then. Have a great month, and talk to you later.